Florence Pollock is standing at the bottom of a wooden ladder with her arms up, waiting for her husband to hand something down from the attic. It's a cardboard box, soft at the corners from age, and when John lowers it into her hands, she feels the weight shift inside. Small, hard shapes sliding against each other. Dolls. Toys that have not seen daylight in years. She carries the box down the hall and out to the back garden, where her 4-year-old twin daughters are waiting, and she sets it on the grass between them without a word of explanation. She has not told them what's inside. She has not told them where it came from. And within seconds, one of the girls is holding up a doll by its arm and saying a name that nobody in that garden has spoken out loud in a very long time. This is still Unexplained. Brief explorations of unsolved mysteries. My name is Mark. The Pollock family lived in Hexham, a market town in Northumberland, in the north of England, close to the Scottish border. Stone buildings, a Saxon abbey at the center of town, sheep farms rolling out into the hills. The kind of place where a stranger gets noticed within a day. John Pollock worked in the milk delivery trade. He'd been raised in the Church of England, but converted to Catholicism, while his wife Florence had grown up in the Salvation Army and became Catholic when she married him. And John carried something else with him too. Something that had nothing to do with either church. When he was 9 years old, he read a novel that mentioned reincarnation, and the idea took root in him and never let go. He later told researchers that as a boy, he used to pray to God at night, asking for proof that reincarnation was real, hoping to prove himself right and the priests at his own church wrong. That's not a small detail. Hold on to it, because it matters for everything that comes after. John and Florence had 2 daughters. Joanna was 11, sociable and dramatic, the kind of kid who put on homemade plays and costume and gave things away without being asked twice. She told her mother more than once, almost as a joke, that she didn't think she'd ever grow up to be a lady. Jacqueline was 6, more dependent on her older sister, still learning to hold a pencil properly. When she was 3, she'd fallen into a bucket and cut her forehead near the bridge of her nose, a wound that left a permanent, slightly indented scar, one that showed up more clearly whenever the weather turned cold. On the morning of May 7th, 1957, a Sunday, Joanna and Jacqueline were walking to church with a friend when a car came off the road and struck all 3 children. They were killed instantly. The driver was a local woman who, according to the account later given to the police, had made a decision that morning to end her own life. She had taken what she believed was a lethal dose of aspirin and phenobarbital, and when that didn't work fast enough, she got behind the wheel of her car. She survived. The 3 children did not. She was later tried at the Northumberland Assizes. For a small town like Hexham, the loss of 2 sisters from one family on a Sunday morning, on the way to Mass, in an act tied to someone else's private despair, was the kind of story that didn't stay local for long. It made papers well beyond Northumberland, and it's part of the reason this case exists in historical record at all. Reporters had already been circling the Pollock family once before, when the twins were toddlers, which is precisely how a psychiatrist an ocean away first heard about them at all. We'll get to that. In the house, the grief split John and Florence in 2 different directions. Florence needed to mourn her daughters as gone. John, almost immediately, became convinced they weren't. By his own account, he felt certain his girls would come back to him, and he said so out loud, to a wife who was still raw enough that the idea felt less like comfort and more like a denial of what had actually happened. Some accounts of the family's history describes this disagreement as serious enough to nearly end the marriage. Florence wanted to grieve. John wanted to wait. Less than a year and a half later, Florence found out she was pregnant again. Her doctor, based on the size of her belly, the position of the fetus, and the fact that neither side of the family had any history of twins, told her flatly to expect one baby. But on October 4th, 1958, Florence gave birth to 2 girls. The doctor had been wrong. John, who had spent the entire pregnancy insisting this was exactly what would happen, felt he'd been right about something no one else believed. They named the twins Jillian and Jennifer. So here's where it gets strange, because it's not any one detail. It's how many of them there are, and how early they started. The physical similarities showed up first, before either girl could speak a word. Jennifer, the second-born twin, had a faint mark near her forehead in almost the exact spot where Jacqueline's bucket scar had been, and it grew more visible in cold weather, the same way Jacqueline's had. She also had a second, rounder birthmark on her left side near the waist, in the same location as a birthmark Jacqueline had carried in life. Jillian had neither mark. And here's the part that made this detail so hard for researchers to wave away later on. When the twins were 20 years old, Dr. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist who eventually devoted his career to studying cases like this one, arranged for blood tests to determine whether Jillian and Jennifer were identical or fraternal twins. The results came back monozygotic, identical, which means they came from a single fertilized egg and share essentially the same genetic code. 2 genetically identical girls, and only one of them carrying a birthmark that happened to sit exactly where her deceased sister's fatal scar had been. Genetics alone doesn't have an answer for that. The family moved away from Hexham to a town called Whitley Bay when the twins were only about 9 months old, too young to have formed any memory of the place they had left. But as toddlers, Jillian and Jennifer began talking about Hexham anyway, and about a school and a park they had, as far as anyone could tell, never once visited. When the twins were around 4, the family took a trip back to Hexham for the first time since the move. Walking down a road towards a park neither girl could see yet, both twins said, unprompted, that they wanted to cross over to play on the swings. They knew the way before the destination came into view. Later that same visit, when their mother mentioned they could eat lunch at school sometime, both girls answered that they had already done that before. But they hadn't. Joanna and Jacqueline had. Then there was the moment with the milk delivery smock. Florence had worn a specific coat while helping John with the milk round years before the twins were born, and she put it away for good not long after her older daughters died. When the twins were about 4.5, John pulled the same smock out of storage to protect his clothes while painting the house. Jennifer looked at him and asked why he was wearing Mummy's coat. Jillian, standing right there, had no idea what her sister was talking about, and Jennifer got genuinely annoyed at her for not recognizing it. When John asked Jennifer how she knew it belonged to Florence, she said simply that her mother used to wear it delivering milk. Jennifer had never seen that coat in her life. Neither had Jillian, for that matter, and yet only one of them reacted to it at all. The dolls came out around this same period. The box Florence carried down from the attic and set on the grass without any explanation. Jillian and Jennifer had reached for a different toy and named it correctly, using names their parents hadn't spoken since before the twins were born, and identified which had arrived as Christmas presents, a detail Florence and John had to stop and privately confirm was accurate. And then there was the day Florence walked in on the girls mid-play. Jillian cradling her sister, describing blood running from Jennifer's eyes, and tying it directly to the place where, she said, the car had struck. There was no blood. There was no car. There was only 2 4-year-olds performing something that felt, to the adult watching, less like pretend and more like recollection. The behavioral echoes ran even deeper than the verbal ones. Jillian was slender like Joanna had been and walked with the same slightly splay-footed gait. Jennifer was stockier like Jacqueline, with an ordinary walk to match. When the girls learned to write, Jillian picked up her pencil correctly on the first try, the way Joanna had. Jennifer gripped hers in a closed fist, the exact way Jacqueline had struggled with before she died. And Jennifer didn't correct that grip until she was 7, occasionally slipping back into it even as an adult. Jillian mothered Jennifer the same protective way Joanna had once looked out for Jacqueline, and both girls gravitated towards their maternal grandmother for comfort over their own mother, echoing a pattern from the household years before the twins existed. Both loved combing people's hair, especially their fathers, just as Joanna and Jacqueline had, and both carried a fear of cars that showed up early and stayed, gripping their mother's hand a little too tightly at the curb. All of it faded by around age 5. John, for his part, made a deliberate choice during those years never to bring up his own belief about reincarnation in front of the girls, and the twins didn't learn what their father actually believed about them until they were about 13 years old. By the time Stevenson caught up with Jillian and Jennifer again in 1978, 20 years old and given blood for the zygosity test, both women said they remembered nothing at all about their early childhood claims. They absorbed their parents' belief about who they had once been the way you absorb a family story, secondhand. Without the memory attached to it, they were by then polite skeptics of the whole idea. Florence Pollock died in 1979. A year after that visit, John remarried, and Stevenson kept in touch with him and with Jillian into the following decade, visiting again in 1982 and corresponding with John until John's death in 1985. And in between those visits, in 1981, something happened that researchers still bring up. Jillian, by then an adult with no conscious memory of her early childhood statements, experienced what she described as a sudden inner vision. She saw herself as a small child playing in a sand pit with her brothers, in a garden with lawns and an orchard, in a house she could describe in specific detail. That house turned out to match a home the Pollock family had actually lived in Wickham, for a period when Joanna would have been younger than 4. Jillian had never been to that house in her life. So here's where it splits, because everyone who has spent real time with this case has to decide what they think it means, and there is more than one reasonable place to land. The first explanation is the one that carries the most institutional weight, and it's built on ordinary human psychology rather than anything extraordinary. British writer Ian Wilson, who reviewed the case critically, pointed out something that's hard to argue with on its face. The only witnesses to almost everything in the story are John and Florence Pollock, and John was a man who had believed in reincarnation since he was 9 years old and had prayed for exactly this outcome. Under this reading, a father that invested in a specific conclusion doesn't need to lie to produce a biased record. He just needs to notice the confirming details and let the rest slide by unremarked. Add 2 older brothers in the house who would have heard the family's history discussed, and you have plenty of raw material for 2 small girls to absorb without anyone consciously coaching them. Where this story runs into real trouble is the birthmarks and a zygosity test. Overheard conversations can explain a child mentioning a school. It cannot explain identical twins developing different marks on their skin before either one had spoken a single sentence. Which brings in a more specific variant, one Wilson himself raised as an alternative. He called it maternal impression. It's the idea that a mother's intense emotional state during pregnancy can somehow physically influence the developing fetus. Meaning, Florence, replaying the horror of her daughter's deaths over and over while carrying the twins, might have unknowingly imprinted those same physical marks onto Jennifer's body. It's a theory that tries to keep everything inside a materialist framework while still accounting for the birthmarks. But it runs into an odd contradiction almost immediately. Florence was the parent who rejected the reincarnation idea outright. If maternal impression requires some kind of psychic transmission from mother to fetus, you're still left explaining a paranormal mechanism just relocated from the twins to their mother and applied to the one parent who didn't even believe in what was supposedly happening. Now, why did it stop at 5? Researchers who study these claims across cultures have noticed the same window again and again. Children start speaking about a previous life somewhere between 2 and 4, and the claims fade out between 5 and 8, right around the time most kids start school. One explanation leans on something psychologists already accept as real, regardless of what you believe about reincarnation. Childhood amnesia. The well-documented fact that almost nobody retains clear memories from before the age of 3 to 4 because the brain's memory systems are still developing the infrastructure needed to store and to retrieve autobiographical detail. If something unusual really is happening to very young children in these cases, this same natural process might simply be closing the door on it the way it closes the door on everything else from that age. Layer on top of that the structure of school itself, a formal environment that rewards a child for participating in a shared, agreed-upon reality that gently discourages the kind of statements that make adults uncomfortable or worried, and you have a second pressure pushing in the same direction. Researcher James Matlock had proposed something a little stranger sitting underneath both of those explanations, what he calls a form of subconscious resistance. The idea that a developing mind might actively suppress access to previous identity as a kind of psychological self-protection, allowing a child to fully become the person they are now, instead of living split between two lives. It's an elegant idea. It's also, by its very nature, close to impossible to test. Then there's the theory built specifically to explain away cases like this one, without accepting reincarnation, which is the living agent psi hypothesis, more commonly referred to as super psi. Under this theory, Jillian and Jennifer weren't remembering anything. They were unconsciously pulling detailed information straight out of their parents' minds through extrasensory perception and reconstructing it into something that felt, to everyone watching, exactly like a memory. There's something almost funny about how this theory operates, because to avoid concluding that two children remembered a past life, you're asked to accept that they instead possessed a form of unlimited psychic mind reading. It solves the verbal claims. It does nothing at all for the birthmarks, since nobody has ever proposed a version of super psi, where a fetus reads its mother's grief and edits its own skin to match. And then there's the theory that Stevenson himself, after decades of documenting cases like this one, kept returning to. It's the idea that consciousness isn't something the brain manufactures and then loses completely at death, but something the brain filters and channels the way a lens filters light, and it under conditions nobody fully understands. That stream can carry forward into a new body, memories, fears, and physical scars included. Researcher James Matlock calls this carrying thread a psychophore, a consciousness stream that imprints itself not only on a developing mind, but on developing tissue. It's the only explanation on this list that accounts for both halves of this case at once. Not just what the girls said as toddlers, but what was already written on one twin's skin before she even said a word. And it isn't an isolated pattern. Across Stevenson's broader collection of documented cases, roughly 35% of the ones where a previous identity was confirmed involved a matching birthmark or a birth defect. Now, I'll be honest with you. This is the theory I find myself sitting with the longest, because it's the only one that doesn't require throwing out half the evidence just to make the other half comfortable. What none of these theories fully settle, no matter which one you find the most convincing, is what it must have felt like inside that house. A father who had prayed as a boy for proof he'd spend the rest of his life believing he'd finally received. A mother who'd lost 2 daughters and then had to watch 2 more small girls perform fragments of a life she was still trying to survive without. And 2 little girls in the middle of it, too young to know they were evidence of anything, who grew up, forgot, and by every account went on to live quiet, ordinary lives they were entitled to keep private. I keep coming back to that image. Florence at the bottom of the ladder, arms full of a box she hadn't opened in years, watching her daughters reach into it and pull out a piece of a life she thought was gone for good. That's as far as this one goes. Still Unexplained is created and hosted by me, Mark Evanoff. You can find the show and episode previews at www.stillunexplained.com and follow us on Instagram at StillUnexplainedPod for brief video previews, often featuring actual images and visuals from the case. Please follow wherever you listen, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.